Welcome everybody to week 9 of the course. This week we're going to be talking about using performance assessment. So the first thing we need to cover is what are performance assessments. Unlike previous weeks where we've talked about selected construction or constructed items, these are assessments in which students perform an activity or create a product. You're not so much measuring knowledge, for example, with test items. You're asking them to show that they know how to do something. And it can measure knowledge and it can measure skills. Because performance assessments are essentially performed, they're harder to grade, but they should be assessed using some type of rubric or checklist. We're going to talk about ways to assess performance assessments later in this lecture. What are some examples of performance assessments? So, actual performances might include a road test. For example, when you get your driver's license, you have to take a road test to show that you can actually perform the act of driving. A musical performance might be appropriate in band or chorus. An art show, a science lab practical. Oral presentations are also a type of performance assessment. When someone has to give a book report or do a PowerPoint presentation, that's a performance assessment. Projects such as extensive papers and dioramas and art projects can be performance assessments, as can open-ended questions. So for example, multi-step math problems, or think about asking a student to construct a graph given certain types of data. There are advantages and disadvantages to performance assessments. First of all, the advantages. Performance assessments are very good at assessing students' abilities to think about a complex topic. So complex thinking. Or to demonstrate skills. Can the student play the oboe, for example? They also encourage teachers to use multiple criteria. So you are, for example, using a rubric to score a science fair project, you're going to score that science fair project on many different criteria. Knowledge of content, presentation skills, appearance of the board, etc. And it's good to use multiple criteria because then you're getting at many different ways of scoring the student, not just one way. Students tend to have less anxiety about performance assessments because they tend to be more fun than paper and pencil tests. There are some disadvantages to performance assessments. They tend to have poor reliability. So you might not all score them all the same way. If you remember your definition of reliability, it means to score things the same way. And so you might score one student higher because you like that student. They're subject to what's called limited sampling. And what this means is that because they're so time consuming, you don't see a lot of other work from the student. So a student might work 6 weeks on a performance assessment and then blow it for whatever reason, and you might think they've done a poor job and they don't really know the skill, and in fact the student might have just been having a difficult time with the assignment, or they might have been not focused on that particular task. A final disadvantage of performance assessment is the time that it takes to create good ones and to create good rubrics or checklists and then to score them. You can think about using performance assessments when your learning targets are focused on deep understanding, reasoning skills, or product. And products in general tend to lend themselves really well to performance assessment. Products of all types. So in social studies, if you're covering the colonization of America and you've asked students to conduct a festival, and they have to choose a colony, and they have to bring in food and prepare a report and do all kinds of things. There's multiple criteria and multiple products. That might be considered a performance assessment. You can use performance assessments also to assess students' process and work habits. So you might actually have a row on your rubric that talks about the format of the project, for example. Now, Most performance assessments tend to be what we call authentic, but not all. And they actually vary in terms of their authenticity. So first let's think about what authenticity means. Tasks are authentic according to leading scholar Joseph Renzulli when they target a real problem. So instead of, for example, in the classroom asking them to do a graph based on some numbers in a math book, if you get them outside the classroom and collect data on pollution levels in the pond and then ask them to graph that, that's a real problem of concern. When they're messy, what does this mean? It means that it doesn't have a simple solution. So there might be more than one correct answer. There might be multiple ways of thinking about something. When they have the potential to change actions, attitudes, or beliefs, and when they target an authentic audience. Generally what these mean is that they could have application outside the classroom, or they could have application for enabling the students to use real skills of real practitioners in the field. Perhaps it will help to see some examples of what an authentic problem looks like. This is one that I published in a recent book that I wrote on science. So these examples are going to be science-based. This might be appropriate. This actually is one I did with one of my middle school classes a number of years ago. Your students love to hike, but there is no guide on the local trail. They hike the trail and return with pictures of flora and fauna, pictures of wildlife and animals and plants. They identify these and create a trail guide app for a hiker that a hiker can download and use. This is a really complex project, and this was actually done after school, but it contains the features of an authentic performance-based assignment and assessment. It's real, it's complex, it's messy. There's not an answer key because there's not one correct answer. It's for an authentic audience, that is somebody outside the classroom that could actually use it. So this type of project is very, very authentic in addition to being a performance-based assessment. If we look at some other examples of authentic performance tasks that individuals could do, these are other examples. So Dan, an elementary school student, develops a comic book depicting the adventures of superhero Sunny and uses it to alert children to the importance of using sunscreen. So again, this is not a pencil and paper task, but it requires that Dan incorporate skills of illustration and also storytelling, learn something about the dangers of the sun, and then do something that could potentially change actions and have a real authentic application outside the classroom. Another one, Carolina, a middle school student, studies patterns of manatee movements. Manatees are large mammals that swim in the canals in warmer climates like Florida, and develops a system to alert boaters to slow down when the manatees are most active. So again, requires research, application outside the classroom, a very authentic project. Carla, a 10th grade student, learns how to use computer algorithm and working with a local scientist applies her knowledge using big data to predict the likelihood of individuals developing a certain muscular disease. And so again, a very bright child might be paired with a local scientist as a mentor and work on this type of authentic project that has learning applications outside the classroom. Now, I don't mean to suggest that all performance-based assessments are going to be like these, but I just wanted to show you examples of the most authentic types of projects. But you can also have authentic learning simply by asking students to use the skills of real practitioners. So for example, in their science fair projects, you could teach them to use data tables to collect data as if they were a real scientist, and to analyze that data and to produce simple line charts and graphs. And that also is a performance assessment. So now that you understand a little bit more about what a performance assessment is, let's talk about how you go about building the task that's going to be assessed, the performance task. We're going to talk about 3 steps, and then we're going to give a little more detail about how to develop the performance task. This will be exactly what you're going to be doing in your performance assessment project, by the way. The first step is to identify the performance task, and so you start by thinking about what standards and learning targets or objectives you would like to measure. And so usually a performance task has more than one learning target because it does tend to be more complex. There are 2 types really of performance tasks. One is restricted and one is extended. The difference in these is just the complexity. A restricted task a student might be able to do in days or hours or even minutes. So for example, what I said before about doing a bar chart with data, that could be a restricted performance task. Whereas the things that I mentioned when I was talking about the science projects, those are extended. Those will take a longer period of time, generally be more complex, and measure more learning targets. The second thing you're going to do after you decide on the standards, the learning targets, and whether to use a restricted or extended task is to think about the description of the task. And it's helpful here to consider the background. So what grade level are your students at? You're not going to use the same type of task for a kindergartner that you would a 5th grader. What's the content area? Math tends to lend itself to things like graphing and application of math to real-world problem solving. But social studies might have a completely different bent towards helping the students analyze or apply what they're learning in class to the outside world or to the past. So you need to think about the course content. Also think about your students and whether any of them have special needs, what the mix of the class is. After you've thought about the background, think about how the task will be implemented. So what kinds of things could you have them do to measure and make sure they picked up the knowledge and the skills that you would like to assess? There's a lot more description about this on page 222 in your text, and I encourage you to review that section before beginning your project. Then you are ready to prepare your performance task question or prompt. This is the wording you will actually show to students. So when you prepare the performance task wording, you want to think about some things. Be sure to integrate both content and skills. So, for example, in graphing, which I come back to, you're integrating students' knowledge about number patterns and numerical sense with the skill of being able to draw a bar graph, for example. It should be to some degree authentic. Now, as I said before, it may not be as authentic as the projects that I described that get students out of the classroom, that have them go and do things for real, quote-unquote, audience. But it should be this. Think about what an actual practitioner could do and encourage the students and develop a task where the students can get a flavor for that, even if only at junior level. So real scientists use graphing all the time. Real mathematicians use graphing. So why is that? That is a somewhat authentic task, even though it doesn't get them out of the classroom. So that's why science projects are authentic to some degree, because they do require that students learn and apply the skills of actual practitioners. If you're teaching children to write and write fiction stories, then you want to have them think about what does it take to be a real author. There are publishing sites, for example, on the internet that will take students' work and publish it online, or the time-old tradition of having students write a story and illustrate it and make their books. Those are all performance tasks. As I said before, it should assess multiple learning targets, not just one, because you're covering so much and so in such a complex form, you're more than likely going to have at least, at a minimum, 2 learning targets for a performance task. It should help students succeed, and so it should be clear and doable and feasible. And another important point is that it should be challenging and stimulating. So you don't want to give something to students in a performance task that's just rote learning, like do 10 problems in a book. That's not a performance task. It should catch the imagination of the student, because students like to work this way. They sense when it's authentic, they sense when it's a real performance task, and they like to work this way, and generally you'll get better results with it. You're going to, for your project as well as in your regular classroom, include scoring criteria. And many of you saw just how complex this was to think about in the formative assessment assignment, where you really had to think about, well, how many points do I give each thing, and how do I score this? And it's a lot more complicated when you get into it than when you first start thinking about scoring. Include constraints when you're preparing your performance task. So think about how much time it will take your students to finish the task. What resources will they need? And generally, I try to discourage teachers from requiring tasks that need a lot of outside resources that you don't have available in the classroom, because students have differing levels of ability to get these resources. Some might have parents that are willing to go out and purchase materials, and some might not. So be sensitive to that. There are 3 ways to assess your performance task, and this is also going to be part of your project: checklists, rating scales, and rubrics. So let's see what the differences between these are. A checklist is basically a set of sentences that outline the criteria that you think are important, and then a yes, no, either it's there or not. So, for example, here's a paper checklist. The topic has been covered in depth, yes or no. The support is provided for the argument, yes or no. At least 3 reasons are provided, yes or no, and the paper follows APA format, yes or no. Now this is simple to construct, but the major disadvantage here is you don't get any finite grading ability. So what do I mean by that? For example, suppose you have a paper that it's been covered somewhat in depth, but it's missing a couple of things. Well, you don't want to check no because it's been covered somewhat in depth. But you don't want to cover yes, check yes, because it's missing some things. So what do you check? So this one is really only appropriate to use if it's very clear cut, if there is a clear yes and no answer, and you expect it to be yes or no. A rating scale offers a little more definition and grading. So here's a rating scale for kindergarten for math milestones. And what this does is it breaks kindergarten math skills up into several areas: numbers and numeration, operations with whole numbers, logic and problem solving, etc. And then it gives you a scale on the right side: never, sometimes, frequently, always. And you get to check as to whether the student can do that. Can the student count up to 20 objects? Well, never, sometimes. Can the student print numbers 0 to 20? So you see how this is used, and this does offer a little more grading ability to be a little more targeted. However, the major drawback with this is its subjectivity. So what does sometimes mean, and what does frequently mean? Never and always, those are pretty clear, but sometimes might mean something different to you than it does to me. So this is not a bad thing to use if you have something that you're just not trying to give grades on, but you're just trying to assess so that you can understand where a student is at and where you need to get them to be. Maybe you want to move them from that frequently to always column, for example. This is the rubric that we've seen before. This is if you remember, an analytical rubric, because every criterion has a row and every column has a point value, and you total the points up. It's very descriptive. It takes a lot of time to develop something like that, but this is a very good way excuse me, to score a performance assessment. When you're thinking about your criteria for the rubric, you should make sure, once again, that they're measurable, and you should use multiple criteria. So in the previous one, we didn't just have one row, we had many rows. Make sure you connect them to your learning targets so that they should be aligned clearly. If you want the student to focus on understanding how to organize their paper, that could be called out as a row on the rubric. Think about what you're looking for in good responses. What is important? And generally, those become your rows on your rubric. But you also want to think about how much weight you want to give to each criterion. So you could say, oh, I really want my students to know, the mechanics, spelling and grammar, and you could weight that twice. Give that twice the point value of any of the other rows on the rubric. That's your decision. And finally, think about the levels. These are the columns. How many levels do you want? Do you want developing, proficient, and above? Usually 3 to 5 work best. Once you get below 3, you don't get an ability to be fine. You lose the ability to grade finely. And so things get lumped together. But more than 5, it just becomes very complicated. Think about what distinguishes a good response from an average response, and an average response from a poor response. And then you're going to word each cell in the rubric so that you can clearly slot the project into one or the other. It's helpful to have exemplars or anchors both for your own scoring experience and for the student. So as I've mentioned in previous lectures, if you can collect samples of student works that are at each different level of the rubric and show them to students, that helps them improve and it helps you to score. So important ideas include to design a rubric that does its job, to write precise criteria and descriptions, and make your rubric student friendly. So they should be able to understand the rubric. Let's take a look at another rubric. Let's say the performance task is to bake the most delicious chocolate chip cookie in the world. Well, that's very subjective, so you're going to have to think about how would you score that. And so we're going to try to create a rubric to assess this task. As I said last week, holistic rubrics view products and performances as whole and describe characteristics of different levels of performance, and criteria are summarized for each score level. An analytic are more separate. All the criterion are each in their own rows and scored separately. Here's an example of a holistic rubric that could be used to assess the chocolate chip cookie task. Delicious level 3. Chips in every bite, consistently chewy, even golden brown. So do you see how we've taken the most delicious chocolate chip cookie, which could be very subjective, and put objective, quantifiable ways to determine. I could see if there's a chip in every bite. I could see if it's consistently chewy. I could see if it's even and golden brown. If you're scoring it, you're probably going to score it the same way because those are very objective criteria. Number 2 is a little bit less. Adequate number of chips. I might actually change that and say chips in almost every bite. It's pretty chewy, but not all the time, and it's a little uneven in color. And level 1, not enough chips, inconsistent chewiness, and too light or too dark. So maybe while this rubric could be improved, I want you to notice two things. One, it's holistic in that every criteria doesn't get its own row. You can lump them all together and give it one score. And two, I want you to focus on how we've made the deliciousness of the cookie a little more objective so that we get a better scoring. Here's the same rubric. Now it's an analytic rubric because every criterion is broken out into a row. And I think we've even added a row. So the number of chips. We have a 4-point scale now. Delicious is 4, tasty is 3, edible is 2, and not yet edible is 1. So to get a 4 on this number of chips, you need to have chips in every bite. Tasty, 75% chips. Edible, 50% chips. And not yet edible, less than 50% chips. So you would score, let's say I had a one that only had 50%, I would give that a 2 for chips. And then I could score texture and color and richness, and in the end I could add all the points up and get an overall score. Let's say I got a 2 for chips, and a 3 for texture, and a 3 for color, and a 2 for richness. Like that would be 2 plus 3 is 5, plus 3 is 8, and 2 is 10. So one cookie might have a 10. And so if you scored that cookie, chances are you would be much closer to my score if you use this rubric than if you use the previous rubric, and certainly much closer on agreement than if we just said which is the most delicious cookie. It's important to think about what descriptors you're going to be using. Descriptors are those words on the top of the columns on rubrics. They're usually qualitative. They're words. They describe the level of performance. So in the last rubric, for example, we had descriptors at the top of that column about edible, for example. There are lists on page 231 of your book of words you might consider using depending on your task. Novice, emergent, proficient, and advanced. Limited, partial, and thorough. Never, seldom, occasionally, frequently, and always. Notice as I describe, 3 to 5 levels is about what most people go with. You should not let the rubric stand alone. I always add a column where I put the points and feedback. So when you get your assignments back from me, the grading rubric is usually on the first page, and the column extends to show you your points and your feedback, what you did well, what you could improve on. And so this is important to do for your students as well. So let's talk about the performance assessment project a little bit. You're going to use the course readings and our in-class lectures and discussions as a guide to create a task and a rubric that you would use with your own students. This must be a performance task. The rubric can reflect assessment of content, process, or both. You should probably have both content and skills. And you might consider different types of performance projects. Choose something you're interested in and is appropriate for the grade level you hope to teach. There are lots of examples in your chapter. Some here are open-ended math problems, oral presentations, science projects, or even very advanced reports. PowerPoint presentations might be something as well. So think about what you want to use, what's the task, and how are you going to structure the rubric. Now, as far as the logistics of how to do this, choose one or more standards to be met. This is going to be due this week, and it's going to be due on the discussion board. So you choose your standards and write one or more learning objectives that will be assessed using the task. And again, I would hope that you would have more than one learning objective simply because it should be a little more complex. And this week, I want you to only give some background information about the task. So explain why the task is appropriate for assessing the learning objectives you've written. Describe the course and where the task would be implemented, so the grade level, the content area. Provide a brief description of how the task is to be implemented. Is it going to be whole class, small group, whether directions will be read, and provide information about the background of the students. And upload all of this to the Blackboard discussion by November 6th. All of these instructions, by the way, are in an instruction sheet that I've asked you to read over in this week's learning module. Please take the time to do this so that it doesn't stack up and you don't get caught by surprise. Next week, by November 13th, you should write the task exactly as you would present it for your learners. So if you're writing a task for pre-K, you're not going to give them it in writing. You need to develop a script. Use the exact words you would say to your students. If your students are reading, then obviously you can write the task. Be very clear in your instructions to students. If necessary, note that the directions and tasks will be read to learners. And be sure that your task relates back to the learning objectives. So upload that by November 13th to Blackboard so you can get feedback. Now that you've determined the task, by November 20th you should be adding a rubric. This rubric should be the type that is matched to your task and grade level, well suited. You should think about the criteria and levels of performance as we've talked about them and in your chapters has described. The criteria should be well aligned with the learning objectives and standards. Descriptions of the criteria should be teachable, clear, identifiable, and measurable. Continuum between levels of performance should be clear and appropriate. That means there should be distinct levels of performance that are all on a continuum. So think about, what does developing mean and what does proficient mean? The rubric, again, should be well aligned with the task. You may use either an analytic or a holistic rubric, but you're going to have to justify your choice after this. You should upload the task again and the rubric to that week's Blackboard discussion board for feedback, and we're all going to be helping each other improve these performance assessments. The entire final paper should be uploaded as a Word document by December 13th. So by that point you've almost finished it, and the only thing you're going to need to add after you make your modifications based on feedback is a justification in which you support your choices. Specifically, you're going to state whether your rubric is analytic or holistic and why you chose this type of rubric. So look at the chapters, readings on why it's important to use either analytic or holistic, and you might want to refer back to that in your paper. Again, this is under the assignments folder, like all of our assignments have been this semester, and you should upload all the parts, the background, the task description, the rubric, the justification, everything you've been uploading to the discussion board, plus your justification, as one Word document attachment to the link. So that concludes this presentation. Everybody have a good week. As always, I encourage you to contact me if you run into any stumbling blocks, and I'll see you next week.